And then I'm going to share our presentation while I'm at it too. All right. Can everyone see that okay? And just a reminder too, for questions or comments or things like that, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom here, or you can enter something in the chat as well, or just wait for a pause and you're welcome to jump in too. We'll just do it however it works best. All right. Let's get started here. We will begin, and our opening devotion comes from Psalm 33 selected verses. I'll read there. We'll start at verse 6 of Psalm 33. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples of no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he has chosen as his own inheritance. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From the place of his habitation, he looks on all the inhabitants of the earth. He fashions their hearts individually. He considers all their works. I think that psalm is a good reminder of kind of the content that we're going to be covering tonight in this selection, these two chapters. We're building on what we looked at last week, but seeing specifically this evening how it applies to God's work as our creator and his power. So beginning here in our study, we'll start going through our slides here. Just a recap of last week. So class number 1, we started the book. We had the preface and then chapters 1.1 and 1.2. In the preface, again, Lewis was simply making the case that the point of this book is to give a general summary of Christianity, kind of the main foundational points to someone who's highly skeptical or someone who maybe doesn't know anything. So it's not going to answer everything in Christianity. It's not going to talk about every topic. In chapter 1.1, he introduced this term that we're building on called the law of human nature. And essentially, the law of human nature from a biblical concept is the natural knowledge of God, the knowledge that all people should have of God's power. And basically concluded in chapter 1.1 with 2 points. There is a law of human nature and people are not good at keeping it. And then chapter 1.2, he looked at some initial objections to the content of the first chapter. He got some people that wrote into him and objected about this natural law. And basically each one of those questions wanted to make the law of human nature more subjective than it is. And so he basically made the case in chapter 1.2 that the law of human nature is absolute and objective, meaning that it exists outside of us and it applies to all people. All right, so that's where we left off last week. We're now getting into chapter 1.3. So we're still in book 1, which is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And then now we are looking at chapter 3 called The Reality of the Law. Our outline for this chapter has 2 points. First, the law of nature versus the law of human nature. We're going to see the distinction of those 2 things. And then consequences, specifically consequences of that natural law and its reality in our lives. Let's take a look at a quote right away from chapter 1.3. Lewis writes there, "The laws of nature as applied to stones or trees may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. For as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. So he's building on that case he made at the very beginning there, that there is a law that applies to all people. And one thing we know for sure about it is that we aren't perfect at keeping it. And I think the opportune or prime word here is ought. We talked about that last week with the word should. The law of human nature tells us what we should do. That's different than what the law of gravity does or what the other laws of nature do. They simply act on those things. A tree or a stone, which he uses as examples, they don't get a choice in whether or not they obey a law of nature. But that's one of the unique features of this law from God in our hearts. The law of human nature is God does not force anyone to obey that law. And that's what leads to this conclusion then that we do not keep it perfectly. So I think he's kind of building off some of those objections from chapter 1.2 here, where he talks about specifically these laws of nature that we know so well. Certainly those in and of themselves are evidence of a lawgiver as well as evidence of God as creator. We talk about those laws, but it's not the same as this law of human nature. There's something different there. And that different thing comes back in with the word ought. Question here right away to throw to you guys. So far, Lewis has responded to quite a few objections about the law of human nature. Why do you think people get so defensive about this topic? Any thoughts come to mind? Why do you think this is such a defensive topic for so many people? Oops. Go ahead, Mike.
I think it's our human nature that fights against rules in general. And so I think it's our human nature, our sinful nature, that would say we want to rebel against something that is telling us we should be this way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point when you, especially with the word should. We don't really like that. We like our independence. We don't necessarily like God telling us that it has to be a certain way. And like you pointed out, we have that inner nature that wants us to be in control, and we kind of want to be the lawgiver. We like to have that control. Other thoughts that come to mind: why would this be such a controversial thing? Go ahead, John.
Did hear? There we go. Took a minute to get it unmuted. Sorry about that. I think also, in addition to what Mike said, because we know we don't do what we ought to do.
Yep, that's the conundrum, right? And I think that's why Lewis is really hammering that point home. If we're accountable to God and there's the lawgiver that is expecting something of us and we can't do that perfectly, then there's a consequence to that. And that's the second half of the chapter here, is the consequences that come along with that law. But it's much easier to want a way out, to not have to have that accountability. One of the passages here that came to mind for me is Matthew 15:9, where Jesus says, out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies, and so on. If that passage is true that Jesus is talking about, then it shows that desire is something that we like to hang on to and something that we like to have control over. All of those things that happen so often in life, those transgressions against God's word, they all come from the same place. Jesus said, out of the heart proceed those things. So very clearly, even Jesus taught that we have a moral problem inside. And that's because we're held to a certain standard that we are not attaining. And that standard is this law of God, what Lewis is calling the law of human nature. But of course, he's going to get a lot of backlash on that, because that's not something that we like to hear, not something that from a human flesh standpoint we like to hear. Any other thoughts come to mind on this question? Let's continue onward. So the law of nature versus the law of human nature. How is creation affected by natural law? So these are the two illustrations that Lewis mentions, the stone and the tree. Again, that they don't have a choice in it. When we're talking about the laws of nature, we're simply talking about what happens to stones and trees and other things. It's not that they have a free will, that they're doing it themselves. It's different with people, though. There's something different about the way God created people, and that's what Lewis is trying to bring out, that makes them affected by the law of human nature in a unique way. Another thought question here to consider, from a biblical perspective, why are humans subject to a higher law than nature? So again, Lewis has been just talking from the standpoint of logic and reason, but can you think of some biblical reasons why this is the case as well? Go ahead, Tim.
Is it simply because we were made in the image of God?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big component of it. I had that as number one on my list, that part of being in that image of God is having a rational mind and having the ability to have a relationship with God. Now, the Bible also talks about how the image of God was also being created in perfection, and we've certainly lost that aspect of the image of God. But we still have a rational mind. We still have the capacity to think about God and to understand him to a certain degree. Rocks and trees and even animals don't have that same rational ability to have a relationship with God. So I think that's definitely something that the Bible points out that separates mankind from the rest of creation. Another part that would come along with that is the idea of a free will. Again, Lewis introduced that concept in the last chapter where he said, we have to recognize that part of the reason this natural law is unique is because God has designed it in such a way that it can be rejected. You can't do that with gravity. You can't do that with the other laws of nature. You don't get a choice whether you accept them or not. They work regardless of how you react to them. And the same is that we can't say the exact same thing about the law of human nature, because God has designed it in a way where we can say no to it, and that hence is the problem of sin. So the idea of the free will there is also unique. Go ahead, Gretchen.
I think it was me.
Yeah, Dad had something.
I was thinking another difference is, well, God created us with a soul, and he created us as the crown of his creation.
Absolutely. Yep. Aspects, I think, that flow from the image of God there, the dominion and authority over creation, and then also the soul. It's interesting that the word soul in the Bible is used for animals too. The word soul just means life. So animals have a soul in the sense that they have a life too. But I think when we typically use that phrase, we're thinking of that image of God, right? That unique life, that one of a kind, special life that God created. So definitely other aspects. And again, maybe we could all boil it down to the image of God as sort of what we're coming back to as what makes us unique. Kathy, did you have a hand up there, or did somebody else mention what you were going to?
I was going to say basically the same thing as Tim about us having a soul, and also that we are created to live eternally. So that makes sense that we would be held to a higher standard, or a higher law than the creation that's going to be destroyed.
Excellent point. Yeah, that's one I hadn't thought of, the eternal nature of mankind, and certainly fitting into man's life there. Another unique aspect of human design. So I think we see, and this is really going to fit well with tonight's lesson, is that hand in hand with this idea that there's this unique law that humans are bound to, goes hand in hand with the unique way that God created humans. And we see a connection between those two things because that's where Lewis goes next, as he talks about God's creation. Let's move on. Good thoughts there. Second half of this chapter is what Lewis calls some of the consequences. And I took that from this quote here in his book. I'm not concerned at present with blame. I'm trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. So I thought that this was important to point out is what are the consequences of this natural law being present in our lives? And when we think of consequences, that can mean that word can be used in two senses. Here's the more common sense, I think. Number one, when we think of the word consequence, we think of the result of something good or bad. And usually we use the word consequence, perhaps with a negative connotation. We think of it as a negative consequence, but there can be good consequences to things too. So a consequence can be a moral result of something good or bad happening because of a person's behavior. And certainly whether or not we believe that there's a universal law of right and wrong that applies to all people is going to have consequences of that nature. But consequences can also have a secondary meaning, and that means basically something that is a general truth about life as we know it. Kind of not looking necessarily at the moral aspect of it, but just whether or not it actually happens or not. A consequence implies something that is actually happening. We might think of that as sort of a consequence of logic. If a consequence of logic is true, then that simply means it's something that happens. And I think Lewis is using that thought in both of those senses. There's a right and wrong consequence that can happen if this is true, but there's also just a consequence of what's true happening, a consequence of logic, if we think about it that way. Some thoughts here on kind of some of the consequences that we get to with this. This isn't something that Lewis brought in, but I kind of thought of this as he wrote this section in the book. And I think there's two very popular modern day philosophies that are exposed by the law of human nature. So essentially, if what Lewis is saying is true, I think there are two consequences of logic, we might call them, that also occur. The first philosophy that's exposed by this is what's called pragmatism. And I gave the definition right there. Pragmatism is that the truth or meaning of something is determined by whether it works. When you think of something that's pragmatic, think of the word practical. A pragmatic person cares about what is practical, basically what can be observed in time that seems to work. They're not a pragmatic person doesn't really care about the abstract idea. They're just focused on whether or not it gets the job done. The second philosophy that's exposed by the law of human nature is a little bit longer word, utilitarianism. Now that's a longer word. Utilitarianism is the philosophy that right and wrong are determined by whether it produces happiness. And when you think of utilitarianism, think of useful. So pragmatic, practical, utilitarianism, useful. So these are two pretty popular belief systems in our modern culture. And I think even though Lewis doesn't mention them by name here, they certainly were present at his time as well. And there are also two reasons why a lot of people don't believe in God and don't follow a Christian belief system. From the pragmatic perspective, the Christian belief system just seems too ridiculous to be true. There's too many unknowns. There's not enough there's not enough practical application to one's day-to-day life. Too many ideas that are out there that are formed about God that can't ultimately be proven. From a utilitarian perspective, Christianity just seems to be too maybe self-deprecating, we might say. It's certainly not built around us pursuing happiness or pursuing what we think is useful. Here's the thing with these philosophies. I believe that the law of human nature kind of exposes both of them for a few reasons. Number one, in both of these areas, you have to ask the question, who gets to decide? So who gets to decide whether or not something works? Who gets to decide whether or not something produces happiness? And if our culture today is going to be honest, the answer to those things would be the majority. And that's why belief systems come and go. That's why they change from generation to generation. Sometimes we correct, sometimes we do things better, but a lot of the times it's just because the majority sentiment has changed. And that's why we look at things differently. It's not so much about whether it is actually right or wrong, or whether it is actually true, but it's really just going along with what has become common. And so right there, we see a problem with the law of human nature and these two philosophies, because again, like Lewis is saying, the law of human nature doesn't care how you feel about it. It's true whether or not you believe it. And these are the consequences that come with it. The second thing about this is that both pragmatism and utilitarianism are based on determining truth, and we can put morality in that concept, truth or morality based on the result. Notice, whether it works or whether it produces happiness always comes down to the result of something. So you judge something by how well you deem it worked. The law of human nature, again, is objective. That means it's true before the result even occurs. And it's universal and applicable to all people. So again, not something that Lewis goes into depth on here. And you may not have heard these terms before, pragmatism or utilitarianism, but I'm sure you've encountered people that have those philosophies in life. I think it's a good example of one of the consequences of the law of human nature being true. If this is true, then these philosophies are quite empty and not healthy for a person's life. Quick question here. It doesn't pop up on our slide, but can you think of examples of our faith or examples from the Bible that are opposed to pragmatism and utilitarianism? Can you think of any examples that kind of show the difference that we're talking about here? And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a Bible story or a character, but it can be a concept of the Christian faith too. Any ideas come to mind? Go ahead, Gail or Dan.
I'm thinking of Romans 8:28, which is a statement of fact that all things work together for good to those that love God. Not depending on the outcome, it's the way it is.
Yeah, that's a great example. And another one where God's plan for my life might not always produce happiness. And God's plan for my life may not always seem to make sense to me. And yet, like you said, that's a statement of fact that before we even get to the result, God promises that it will work out for our good. So definitely something that flies in the face of these philosophies. Another example would be just the topic of forgiveness. It certainly doesn't seem practical to forgive someone who's wronged me when they don't deserve it, when they haven't shown that they're sorry. When it takes me swallowing my pride to do that, that certainly doesn't feel like a very useful or practical thing to do. Even the concept of there being doctrines or teachings of our faith. A lot of those doctrines and teachings are abstract, meaning that, you can't go out and touch and feel them. They're concepts that you think about in your mind. You know them to be true, but you know them to be true because you're trusting God's word on them. It's not because you've necessarily seen or observed them. Think of Thomas at the resurrection of Jesus. The pragmatic person would say, oh, that's not practical. That's kind of how Thomas was acting. And yet Jesus, showed Thomas, you trust these things by faith. You take God's word at his word. I mean, can you think, there's really no doctrine of the Bible that you can really think of that makes sense to people based on our observation, based on how we would define it. So I think these are good examples of when you lay that foundation of the law of human nature, which is what C.S. Lewis is trying to do. We haven't even gotten into any of the Christian teachings yet, but that's why the foundation is important. That's what makes it critical. Okay, continuing onward. Oh,
Pastor,
yeah,
I've
go
just,
ahead.
I've just one other thought with regards to consequences. This is not as this is a pragmatic thought. I'm thinking that in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were created, God didn't envision Adam having a career in law enforcement. I'm thinking that law enforcement is sort of a consequence of man's propensity to break the natural law. And while people who break the law think it might bring them happiness or it might be very practical, others decide that no, that doesn't fit the definition of happiness or practicality.
Yeah, good point for sure. I think you're right about Adam with that. That is, I think that's definitely a consequence of sin. There was no need for that, especially when they were able to keep the law perfectly before the fall. Yeah, very much so. Good points. Moving forward, there is still in the idea of consequences there. I took that example, if you read the chapter here, where Lewis talks about, well, isn't the law of human nature really just what we say is best for ourselves or best for society? And he uses that, he shows how there's circular reasoning there, where if you don't have a lawgiver over all of it, it really just becomes circular. He starts with the first thought here: why ought I to be unselfish? And these quotes come right out of the book. Well, number two, because it's good for society. Well, why should I care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally? And the answer to that would be because you should be unselfish. So round and round we go. If we don't have a lawgiver that is over all, we really can't make sense of it. So this graphic here, you might call what morality and truth would look like without a lawgiver. And that's where Lewis is getting to, which he'll get to in the next chapter more specifically, is that if the law of human nature is true, then there's a lawgiver that has given it. And that's what starts to lead us to the concept of God. So one of the quotes here out of the book: it begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So again, he's kind of saying here the same thing he's been saying from the beginning, but what he's doing is going down the different avenues that people want to go down to take it away from God. And he's bringing it back to this and showing how those don't answer what we observe. So chapter 1.3 summary, kind of two thoughts here. Number one, the law of human nature only makes sense if it exists outside of us. And then number two, the reality of this law impacts what we believe is true and moral. So these are the steps that we're building here, and we're seeing the value of this foundation of the natural knowledge of God. We might think that he's spending a lot of time on this, but one of the reasons we have so many different beliefs in our culture today is because people don't have this foundation, which is really very apparent from the world around us, and also just from basic logic, that we should know that these things are true, which is, again, why we haven't seen a lot of Bible passages being cited. Any thoughts or comments on this chapter before we move on to the next one? Let's go ahead and do that then. So we're at chapter 4, same book, book number 1 again. Chapter 4 is what lies behind the law. So our outline here has 3 parts. The first one, 3 views on the universe. The second one, what we know best and what it tells us. And number 3, a logical proof of creation. So here's where we take a bit of a turn in this chapter, if you will. And we're starting to get some direct application to something in the Bible, some type of truth about our faith, as we now get to Lewis applies these logical concepts about God's existence to the topic of the origin of the world. So the first part is 3 views on the universe. So this is how Lewis summed up the 3 views. He said, basically, no matter who you are, you fit into one of these 3 categories. The first one is the materialist, and this quote comes from this chapter. Lewis says, matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed. Nobody knows why. And that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. So that's how he summarizes the materialist view. And the conclusion to that is, if that's the case, there is no higher truth or morality to life. The second view is the religious view. And Lewis says, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. So the conclusion, if that's true, is that the designer of the universe is also the lawgiver. That's what we're getting at here. And again, we certainly from God's word can say a lot more about who he is than just this summary. But again, Lewis is approaching it from the perspective of not knowing anything about what the Bible has revealed yet, and just looking at it from a logical perspective of what we know. Anybody should be able to say the religious viewpoint, even if they don't know any type of theology. And then the third viewpoint, which wasn't with these first 2, but Lewis added it later on at the end of this chapter. If you saw that, it was kind of in a footnote. So I just put it in here as well. The third view is what he calls the life force view. And he says there, the small variations by which life on this planet evolved from the lowest forms to man were not due to chance, but to the striving and purposiveness of a life force. So again, the conclusion here, although it's phrased differently, would really be the same as the materialist view. There is no higher truth or morality to life because there is no lawgiver. It's just this ambiguous, unidentified life force. Regardless of which view you have, Lewis concludes this way, though. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. So that's kind of what he goes on to describe in the chapter. And I think this fits pretty well with some of the modern objections we hear to our faith today, and especially to creationism, because especially this emphasis on science. We are used to hearing that you cannot be a religious person and be a scientific person, that those 2 ideas are completely opposed. Either you're a person of faith or you're a person of science. You can't be both. And that's really in part what Lewis is kind of tackling here in this chapter. Because the life force seems to kind of blend both thoughts, I kind of wanted to dig into that just a little bit more. I think life force really equals theistic evolution. Basically, when you try to combine God and evolution. And theistic evolution is the idea that basically God exists, but he used evolution to create the world. And again, God is kind of, almost some people call it sort of like a clock, where God has wound up the clock and then let it go. And now the clock is just playing out. That's kind of what God has done with the universe. That he's not really active in the universe. He's not involved in our lives. We really can't know anything about him. We can't have a relationship with him. He's just sort of that life force that's out there. So it sounds better than evolution, but really it ends in the same boat as evolution, pretty much the denial of the true God. Some of the quotes from Lewis on the life force, he calls it also creative evolution. One reason why many people find creative evolution so attractive is that it gives one much of the emotional comfort of believing in God, and none of the less pleasant consequences. Here again, we have the topic of consequence coming up. If the lawgiver has given that law, there is a consequence. Another quote, the life force is a sort of tame God. You can switch it on and off when you want, but it will not bother you. All the thrills of religion and none of the cost. Is the life force the greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has yet seen? I thought that just really hit the nail on the head, especially because don't we all love the thrills of religion? I've heard people talk about that so many times, haven't you? But really, Lewis is getting to the point here of this is what we want. By human nature, we want to be the one that's making the decisions. We want to take God if we want him, but we also want to kick him to the curb if we don't want him. And how often do we see, and even in ourselves experience, the attitude of wanting to hear the good things about God, but not wanting to hear the ways that he calls out our sin. I think he's very much on point that this is a very attractive belief system, and it's also very common in our day and age. I think the way that our culture is trending, you get a lot of people today that are theistic evolutionists because they want to blend those two concepts. There aren't as many strict evolutionists anymore as there used to be. We're just getting too much evidence of a designer for people to really believe literal evolution as much as it used to be believed. The last thought here that I wanted to point out is Lewis mentions the emotional comfort. I think theistic evolution really is based on an emotional response. It's not really a fact-based decision, in my opinion. I think it's based on this inner desire that people have where they feel the pressure of the world to fit in and follow the way the world views things, but also wanting to retain some of that inner knowledge that they know about the reality of God's existence. And Lewis just right here really shows the fault in that belief system that you have to be on one side of the fence. You can't try to straddle that fence. It doesn't work. You end up in the same place without God. Any questions or thoughts on this point about the life force or theistic evolution? I'm gonna. All right. If we don't have anything else, we'll continue on. I wanted to add a little bit more here about the concept of science and how we hear that argued. And I think this part doesn't come from mere Christianity, but I think it applies pretty well to this chapter. Answers in Genesis has kind of argued this point for many years, and they make a distinction between what they call observational science and origin science, also operational or historical. So observational science would be kind of like what takes place in present time. Answers in Genesis defines it as a systematic approach to understanding that uses observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable experimentation to understand how nature commonly behaves. So again, present focused, being able to do research here in the present time to understand the natural world around us. Origin science is a little different though, and that's interpreting evidence from past events based on a presupposed philosophical point of view. So origin science is when you're trying to basically understand the history of the world, the natural world, by looking at things in the past. And there are things you can do to test certain areas of the world around us. You can make assumptions and hypotheses about the past, but ultimately no one knows because no one was there to observe it. You ultimately can't get the burden of proof that you can in the present time when it comes to questions of the past. So Answers in Genesis has been saying this for a long time about the word science, that you have to define what type of science you're talking about when you use it in a general way. Our culture really doesn't do that, especially when they make the claim that Christians can't be scientific. Well, there's proof after proof of plenty of Christians who have done operational science and created things and understood things about the natural world. But what they're talking about is origin science. Another quote from Answers in Genesis, a different resource, kind of sums it up by saying, both creationists and evolutionists have the same sets of data, the same evidence, and often the same techniques to examine their evidence. The different conclusions, therefore, must be based on presuppositions or worldview. So the same evidence, but different conclusions because we come from a different perspective on what is true. Obviously, if you come into a situation with the presupposition that God does not exist and there can never be anything supernatural, you're going to look at the past of the world much differently than somebody who does believe those things. Nice thing about Answers in Genesis too is they always kind of share their thoughts in different forms of media, and I like their cartoons too. So I think this cartoon kind of describes what we're talking about here. You have the guy saying, I have a PhD in astrophysics. I'm published in multiple peer-reviewed scientific journals. My research in sunspot activity has, so on, so on, so on. Do you believe in evolution? No. So you don't believe in science. So that's what we're so used to hearing, even today. That's such a common argument, and it's easy to feel intimidated by that. But I don't think there's a need to do that. I think the thought here is, when did the idea of evolution evolve into science? That's also what Lewis is getting at here, that science cannot answer the question of origins. Whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, science is not going to give you all the answers that you want. And so nobody can prove their view based on science alone. That's all that he's trying to do. And it makes sense too, based on the discussion that we're having, because if one of the things that we can admit about ourselves, which Lewis has already said, is that we are limited, we don't have all the knowledge, we can't keep the law perfectly. And if science is based then on our observation of things, and we are limited, well, then science is limited too. And it's not because science as a field of study is a bad thing by any means. It's part of one of the gifts of our reason that God has given us. It's just, we have to be able to say science is not opposed to religion, and it's not there to be an enemy of our faith. Because it can't on its own answer these deeper questions that we're looking at. So hopefully that was a little bit of a helpful tangent there on some of the content that we're looking at here in this chapter as we talk about origins. The second part of this chapter, what we know and what it tells us. Just a couple of quotes there from the book. There is one thing and only one thing in the whole universe which we know more than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. So Lewis here is making the case that we shouldn't look to science to answer all this. We should look also to what we have in ourselves. We know ourselves. And part of knowing the origin of life is knowing who we are as well. And the point that he's making with the law of human nature is that God has put something into us that helps us understand who he is. And if we can understand the one who gave the law, we can, by extension, then understand the one who designed the law. And if he designed the law, then he's also the designer of everything else that we know. So instead of just looking to what people call science, we should also look to what we know as well, looking at our own natures, looking at ourselves. And you can look at these two paragraphs as essentially what Lewis is trying to do here in book number 1 of Mere Christianity. He's coming from the perspective of Let's approach these things from what we know to be true by our observation and our logic, the things that we all can agree on as starting points. And there's things that we can know about God from those positions. Any questions before we move to the final part of this chapter? I feel like I'm going a little fast, but feel free to jump in if you have any questions or thoughts. Okay, we'll continue. Moving to the final part of this chapter here, a logical proof for creation. So Lewis didn't exactly lay this out in in the form of a logical proof, but I think his writing kind of reflected that. So what I try to do here is show what he was getting at in this chapter as a logical proof. So we're going to have basically an overall question and then some premises that help us get information about that question, and then the conclusion that we come to based on that evidence. So that's sort of the logical proof way of doing things. So the question overall in this chapter is, does the universe happen to be what it is for no reason? Or is there a power behind it that makes it what it is? I think that's a direct quote from the book there of what Lewis is asking. So as he's explained it, what are some of the premises that give us information about this question? Well, premise number one, if there is such a power out there, then it is not an observable fact because it is the reality that makes the universe. So Lewis used the example of an architect in a house. You can go into a house and you can see the furniture and the lights and the doors and all the different intricacies of the house, and they can be an example of design, but they are not the same thing as the architect. When you look at a couch in the house, or you look at the shape of a room, that's not seeing the architect, but it's seeing evidence of the architect. So he's making the point, fact number one is that we should expect not to be able to see the reality behind the universe when he's thinking of God there, because what we're seeing is what God has created, and he is above those things. The second premise is we can only use what we have access to gain information. Lewis calls this our case, or he used the example of the mailman delivering packages. So when the mailman delivers packages, I don't see every single house he goes to and every single package that he delivers and what's inside of every single package that he delivers. But because the mailman delivers packages to my house and I can see what's inside those packages, I can get a pretty good idea of what the mailman does. I don't have to see what everybody else sees. I don't have to be in everybody else's business. Just looking at my case, opening my package can reveal information that applies to a greater number of people than I can witness. And the same is true of God. We can only use what we have access to. We only have one package, if you will, that we have access to. We don't get to see everything about God. But there are absolute things we can say about God from what he has allowed us to open up. And certainly the law of human nature in the heart is one of those packages, if you will, that God has given us. His word would also be another one, but we haven't gotten to that yet. Premise number three, what we know, so our case, is that there is an inward pressing command that is trying to get us to behave in a certain way. So an inward pressing command, which we would call the conscience. And that's really the same as the law of human nature that we've been calling it in the book here. And premise three is something that Lewis has already established, obviously. We all feel this inward pressing command of what we ought to do in life, right and wrong. And like we said, with pragmatism and utilitarianism, it's not about the result, because we know it before we get to the result of things. We feel it before we get to the result of things. So it's not just a consequence of something. It's bigger than that. It's beyond that. And so we know that to be true. We are feeling that. Premise number four, This inward pressing command is found in all people, and it is not derived from personal desire, feeling, or social convention. So these three thoughts here are things that we looked at last week, where that was one of the objections to what Lewis was writing, is that, oh, this is just what different communities of people have their different views of what the natural law is. It is true that cultures are different and people have different ways of expressing themselves in cultures, but all cultures also share universal truths that they believe are right and wrong. Think of murder as a clear example of that. No matter how diverse a culture is, no matter how different two cultures are, that's shared across all groups of people. So this pressing command is not something that's just personal and subjective. It's not just a matter of fitting in with the whole group. It's bigger than that. Premise number 5, an inward pressing command that operates in such a way would not exist without a command giver. So again, this is one of those rudimentary titles for really what Lewis is getting to as God. He's talked about it as the right and wrong, the reality behind the universe, the lawgiver, the command giver. These are all phrases that are pointing to a God that is above us. So if all of these premises are true based on what we know about ourselves and what we can observe, then our conclusion should be this. Therefore, we conclude that there is a power behind the universe that makes it what it is. And that would certainly lead to what we call creationism. Now, we're not using that term yet, again, because we're not yet getting into the Bible per se with what Lewis is describing, but we're certainly talking about that. And Lewis has the quote in his book, "Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions." And what he means by that is, this should get us thinking about the reality of God. If these things are true, even if you know nothing about the Bible, boy, we're making a case here for the existence of a God. And this is just based on what we can observe and what we know in our hearts. There's pretty strong evidence here. So I think from Lewis's own personal life, this is really the nagging thing in his heart, that despite all of his inner desires to reject God and to not want anything to do with organized religion or Christianity, he was vehemently opposed to all that. He just couldn't escape the suspicion that was aroused when he looked at the facts, when he looked at them fairly. And I think the same is true of all people, which is what we've talked about. God has designed human life to be like this. And I think part of it is to give us a pressing desire to find him and to figure out who this command giver or this higher power is. So he summarizes the chapter with this thought. So far, he says, I haven't even talked about Christianity. He says, all I have got to is a something, and he purposely capitalizes that something, again, talking about this higher being. All I've got to is something which is directing the universe and which appears in me as a law, urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. So again, he's being clear with the reader. This is all we've done so far. We haven't even started looking in the Bible. Now in our study, we have been, but in the book itself, he has not. So a logical proof for creation. And I think this does hold up under scrutiny. I'm not saying that through logic, we can prove that God created the world, especially as he defines it in the Bible. We don't need logic. That God says, by faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. We accept these things by faith. I'm simply looking at the general idea of, did the universe come out of nothing, or was there a design behind it? I think we can see logical proof for a design for sure. And I think that fits because God tells us in his word, Romans 2:14-15, we looked at this last week, that we can know about his basic existence through our conscience. That's one of the reasons God has given us this conscience or this natural law, is so that we would know that he exists. He says in Romans 2, no matter who has his word, no one has an excuse to deny that God exists, because they should know in their hearts. So if that's true, that we can know about God's existence through our conscience, then I think we should be able to work backward from that and form a logical proof for God's design based on what we know through our conscience. And that's kind of what we're doing here on this slide, is showing a logical proof for design and God's creation just based on what we know in our conscience. And I think that's what Lewis is doing in this chapter too. One of the things that I wanted to mention too, I don't have this on the slide, but Lewis writes in the book, one of the other thoughts he brings in here, he says, the only way in which we could expect the higher lawgiver to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or command. I think we want to be careful about that phrase because in our fallen human natures, I don't think we should be able to expect to know anything about God. The Bible tells us eye has not seen nor ear heard. So yes, God has designed us to have an awareness of him, but to know him personally, we don't have an expectation of that. I think Lewis has to, that phrase was worded a little bit too much on the edge there. But again, he isn't necessarily dealing with the specific teachings of Christianity yet. So maybe that's where he was coming from on that. Okay. To sum it up here, at this point, Lewis is only making the case for the existence of a higher power. We call that theism. Theism comes from the Greek word theos, which is the word for God. So theism is just a basic belief in a God, not defining who that God is. What are the advantages and disadvantages to this approach when it comes to our faith? Any thoughts on that question? Basically, just looking at God in a theistic perspective. Gretchen or Tim, one of you raised your hand there. Go ahead.
Sure. I guess one thought that comes to mind is just knowing that there is a God. We probably can see certain things about him, like that he's powerful and that he has wisdom in creation. But I don't think that gives us any clue about how we fit in. We don't see his love. We don't know how he feels toward us, if that's the limit of our knowledge of God. And we only see those things through Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Oops. Yeah, good point there for sure. I was just going to write that down. So a pro would be knowing there is a God. And a con would be maybe not knowing our place with God. Or we could say the revealed knowledge, as you mentioned with the gospel. Mike, I think you had your hand up there.
I had a similar thought to what Tim had said, that we really don't understand anything about God's love or about our Savior through just this theistic approach.
Very much so. I think that's definitely the biggest point that would be a con to this whole equation. I'll just draw an arrow up there to the revealed knowledge. Caleb, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking of a pro of this is that when you run into people who are just like, well, it takes the idea of having to prove things by the Bible. You're not, a lot of people don't necessarily believe the Bible is true. So they're like, well, what if the Bible isn't true? It kind of helps defeat that argument because it looks at the logic and it looks at just the simplicity of intelligent design.
Yeah, very much so. I'm going to call that the proper use of logic. And we talked about that might be like a common ground that we can start with people at and kind of like what Lewis is doing in the book here, and talk about it from a perspective of what we agree on. Karen, go ahead.
I don't know. One thought I had, more a con than anything, is just I would just walk around in despair because I would just be like, I don't measure up. You know, your conscience and knowing what you ought to do and you don't do it, I would just be miserable. I would think, I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. I think that's living by the law, because we'd have to, right? We don't, if we just have a theistic understanding of God, we don't know of his love yet, like others have said. And so you're operating by law, and that's a really tricky, deceptive thing, because it feels really like that'd be great. Like, oh yeah, I can live in harmony with God, and I can know of his existence, and I can you know, embrace that in life, and that'll be so liberating, and I'll be able to be a good person and all this and that. But it doesn't play out that way because of sin. And that would, like you said, it'd be a really despairing way to live at the end of the day. But we don't, inside in our flesh, we don't often think that about it right away. We that flesh tempts us to think that it's going to be so great. Great thoughts here. I had as another pro, you know, that, you know, we could say theism, at least from a logical standpoint, seems better than atheism. So that might be a pro. But then I also had a con like that, where theism from a spiritual standpoint is the same result as atheism. So, you know, depending on which perspective you come on, it might seem better, but you quickly realize it's not what we need. So yeah, great thoughts here for sure. I think it's where we're seeing here with this question, there's value to what we're learning about from these opening chapters, but there's definitely more there that we want to build on. We're really just laying foundation right now, and hopefully it's helpful, but we want to realize this isn't the end all be all here either. Gail, go ahead.
I have one thought which is consistent with Karen's thought. It is that I say to myself, okay, there is this higher power, and I know because my conscience tells me that I make bad choices, and then I'm left with this question, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah, exactly. Very much like what Karen said. And so that is definitely the disadvantage of it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people, they embrace theism and they only go that far. And faith becomes more of an academic, logical thing for them, rather than what it really is, a gift of the Holy Spirit created through the gospel. So it's important that we understand there's value to knowing the existence of God and how we can use that, but it's not a place to stay at in our faith. It's really not faith at all. But I think there are many Christians that take the label Christian and yet really are kind of only theists, and they're content with that, because compared to the rest of the world where atheism runs rampant, it seems like a much better position to be at. But there's certainly much to the revealed knowledge of God, which we haven't really dug into yet. But like you said, Dan and Karen, kind of what the natural knowledge does is it's designed by God to show us the cavity that's there, and which the gospel can only heal. And so important to do that, but that's not where you stop either. We want to keep seeing all of God's message. One of the passages that came to mind here for me was James 2, verse 19. You've probably heard it before. There, James writes, "You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble." So even you can think the demons are theists. Like, they recognize that there's a God. Even the demon that Jesus cast out said, "We know who you are, the Holy One of God." But that's not faith. So if that's what the demons have, we're probably not a good spot for our faith to be. Another section would be John 3:18-19. We had that on Sunday as our scripture reading. Jesus says, "He who believes in me is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God." So it's not just a matter of knowing that there's a higher power out there. It's faith in the only begotten Son of God that gives us life. And many other passages I'm sure could come to mind as you think about that question some more. Good comments though. Thank you. Just a chapter summary here. Number one, the debate about the origin of life is an area where we see the application of the law of human nature. So here's where we're finally getting into an area of application, and I think we can see how that applies to an element of our faith as we use the Word of God too. So it's nice to see how the foundation he's been setting here has an application to something we encounter quite often in our faith. And then number two, even from a strictly logical perspective, evolution is not compatible with creationism. So going back to that theistic evolution or the life force or the creative evolution, whatever term you want to give it, they just don't fit. You can't get them to fit no matter how much you try. And the law of human nature is a pretty important proof to show why that's the case. So chapter summaries here this evening for chapter 2, class 2, I'm sorry. Chapter 1.3, here's my summary. There is a higher reality above and beyond the facts of human behavior. And then 1.4, the law of human nature affects how we think of life and its origin. And I think you could take this thought of 1.4 and take it to other areas too. It's not just something that affects the doctrine of creation or what one believes about the origin of the universe. The law of human nature really has an effect on every element of your faith too, and how you view your relationship with God, which is why we're establishing that foundation. I did ask last week if anyone wanted to share a theme that they had as they read these chapters throughout the week. Did anybody have a theme to either of the chapters that they wanted to share? Not a problem if you don't. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't neglecting anybody there. So, same thought for next week too. If you think of anything that really hits the nail on the head for the chapter as you read through it, go ahead and write that down and please do share it with us. Let's go back to our screen here. Any final thoughts or questions on tonight's content? Again, when Gretchen and I were talking about this, we both kind of said, there's a lot there. It kind of hurts your head after you read it. So it can be difficult. And I think those that appreciate the book the most are ones who often read it multiple times throughout the years too. And that can be valuable too. So hopefully these summaries are helpful in kind of consolidating the main points of these chapters and seeing the direction that he's taking us. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, well, let's close. I will like to close with the final verses there of Psalm 33. We opened with that, and try to think of these thoughts in view of what we studied here in these chapters tonight. So we close there, starting at verse 18. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death, and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart shall rejoice in him, because we have trusted in his holy name. Let your mercy, O Lord, be upon us, just as we hope in you. Amen. Okay, well, thank you for joining us again this evening. Hopefully the study came through well on your computers there. We'll get the video updated and it'll be on the website, and we won't be on next week. We won't have a Wednesday study next week because that'll be our first Friday study on the 29th. Caleb and Rachel Meyer will be hosting our Friday in-home Bible study on September 29th. It also happens to be Caleb's birthday, so keep that in mind if you come. So we'll be off next Wednesday, but then we'll pick back up from there with our next study, and the schedule should be online as well. All right. Appreciate everybody coming. Hopefully you benefited from the study, and have a blessed night.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.